that will apply that even if there is no deal. But of course, if there is no deal, there will be no mechanism to police it. And that's, as I said earlier about trust, an important issue. It's not just happening, it's the fact that the withdrawal deal dealing with EU citizens has within it a mechanism whereby they can enforce their rights, which is a very European thing, which we've tended not to think about too much. You have rights, and you should be entitled to enforce them. And that's very much the basis, for example, of European jurisprudence. And we need to have that here. Sometimes it's hard to do. With an unwritten constitution, it's hard to do. Yeah.
I have an online question from Ken MacDonald, who says, sterling has fallen considerably against other currencies when the no vote was announced, and currently we're still in the EU. What do you expect to happen on the 29th of March next year as regards currency? Oh, gosh.
I am not exactly. I don't want to be responsible for people going out and speculating tonight. Okay, I have no idea. I mean, the fall in sterling, of course, has been beneficial for exporters. They have found that useful. It's been pretty bad for importers, and it's been pretty bad for tourists. I actually saw something today I was involved in which people were getting parity euros for pounds, which is where we are. I have no idea where it will be, but this is, in general, in my view, not good for our economy, and that's the issue. The way in which the value that any currency has is a product of the view of the international community about the economic prospects of that country and how that country is managing itself economically. This is not a good set of circumstances, in my view, for anybody that's predicting the economy and how it will do. The Scottish Government's figures, which are very similar to the UK Government's figures, we published ours. If you remember, the UK Government hid theirs until they were forced to publish them. They're broadly the same, and they show that there will be a difficulty over a substantial period of time. So that will reflect upon all the international indicators. But I'm certainly not going to predict currency movements. Certainly, that's way outside my pay grade, or ability, I have to say. Okay, good. Other questions? Please. Sorry, and Alistair's got his microphone.
Just try not to forget the question in that. So, in all of this, how does the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament avoid taking the blame for things that come through Brexit once it's done?
Well, I think there's two sets of blame that are floating around. One is Brexiteers blaming people for the difficulties and problems that exist. See that quite often. I noticed a civil servant I know tweeting the other night about the way that civil servants were being attacked. And scapegoats are being sought. And, undoubtedly the Scottish Government's principal stance on this will be something that some Brexiteers will wish to blame for whatever takes place. In terms of the consequences of Brexit, it's really important that we make it clear, as we do make it clear. First of all, we, as a nation, we didn't vote for this. But secondly, that to be realistic, we cannot mitigate against all the harm of this. And it's really important we tell people that, and that we would rather stay in the EU. Now, these are all messages it's quite difficult to put over in a single sentence, but we need to stress those things. I mean, the Scottish Government has tried, certainly over the last period it's been in office in the last 10 or 11 years, to mitigate on occasions where there's been damage being done by the UK Government. The bedroom tax is an obvious example. But there's some things you can't mitigate. We couldn't mitigate, in certain circumstances, for some of the things that will come out of this. The ending of access to the European Investment Bank. We can't mitigate that. We don't have the resource to do that. So in all those circumstances, we have to explain to people that cannot be done. I hope people accept we are as good as our word on that. There are things that we can't do. But what we can do, we will do. And that's also part of the problem. We are constantly looking at what is happening and saying, what can we do to assist these circumstances? And that will be true later this week when we see the text of the 70 or so notices. We will have to say that we'll do everything we can, but some things are out with our gift. Okay. Questions? Max?
Is it on? Yes, it is on. Given what's happened over the Brexit and the way things have gone, there's not only a threat, there's a threat to devolution as well in the way that things have gone. And whether or not independence can be secured, it seems to me it's important to keep devolution. And within the 7 years that they've got, we could see the end of it. And both the UK parties, to my mind, are not really interested. And if they want to do something, they just go ahead and do it.
I think you're right. In the first thing we published on this in December 2016, Scotland's Place in Europe, we argued for an extension of devolution because we felt there were certain things which we were challenged by with Brexit that we needed additional powers to do. We still believe that that is the case. You know, there are things, trade is a good example. Next week I'm going to publish a paper, a Scottish Government paper on trade. But I gave a lecture on it in Dublin about 6 weeks ago. Trade is reserved. Trade negotiations are reserved. But the implications of trade negotiations will be felt on devolved areas of competence. You know, the mythical, well, not the mythical, but the fabled chlorinated chicken, you know, will have an impact on food standards and will have an impact on agriculture. So we need to be engaged in that process of trade in a way that is meaningful. So that's an extension of the devolved powers. Now, I do agree, however, that the devolved powers are under threat. We've seen that with the power grab that we've had. I think that there are, as I indicated, people who know nothing about devolution. I think there are also those who are hostile to devolution. I would be surprised to find that Boris Johnson was a friend of the Scottish Parliament. In fact, I'd be gobsmacked to discover he was a friend of the Scottish Parliament. And when we talk about scapegoating, I think there is a possibility that the scapegoat will be, well, you know, we need unity in these circumstances, so devolved administrations are an irrelevance to that. Now, I think the people of Scotland would not accept that. I think that's a clear set of circumstances we have to argue. But I also think that the best way, you know, in the end, to protect the constitutional settlement is to take it to its logical conclusion. Because if you take it to the logical conclusion, nobody can do that. They can't interfere in it. So if you believe that devolution is the right thing and you think devolution has worked, then one of the arguments you might want to consider is if we can do that well in some things, should we do it well in all the things that we're engaged in? And should we have the opportunity to do so? Trade, international relations are areas. There's clearly an attempt to hem us in, too. If you watch the, and I'm sad enough to have watched most of it, but if you watch the Supreme Court case some weeks ago, you know, the Advocate General, Lord Keane, was keen to argue an interpretation of the international relations reservation that was all-embracing. That essentially the Scottish Parliament could do nothing and say nothing about international relations because it was all reserved. Now, that is, in my view, a ludicrous argument because we have a power to deal with EU legislation. And therefore, there is a role for the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government in international relations because we have an obligation to take EU directives and other things and put them into Scots law. But, you know, that's the type of erosion that's taking place all the time. So, expand the powers and take them to their logical conclusion is, I think, the best way to do so. We're trying to do so.
Can you just repeal the Act of Union then?
I'm always very cautious about people who say, you know, about once every 6 weeks somebody writes to me or emails or tweets or puts in Facebook a miracle way of repealing the Act of Union. There is some extraordinary thing. You know, there's something written in invisible ink on page 26 or something. I just don't think life's like that. I just don't think it's going to work like that. If you're going to do this, you've got to do it in the honest, straightforward way. So, yeah, Lackey. Which makes it more important that we do, in my view. I think you have to be... I remember... Alex Salmond always used to observe, and he's absolutely right to have observed it, and he's still right with this, that seeking, you know, constitutional change and independence is very important, but the way you do it is as important as what you do. And you have to do it. You can't do it by stealth. It's impossible to do it by stealth. You have to do it by seeking the active, sincere, full-hearted involvement of people who are going to choose it. And, you know, with all its difficulties, I still think that's the right way to do it. Lackey, sorry. It's a microphone.
It's a microphone. I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but how much do you think?
Surely not.
No, I don't believe in all that sort of nonsense. But well, he does. But how much do you think it suits the British government the fact that the Assembly in Stormont isn't sitting? Do you think that is an issue? And do you think maybe the DUP's 1 billion has got anything to do with it? Or is that just me sitting beside Alistair?
Yeah, it's rubbing off on you, Lackey. Be careful. I think there are advantages and disadvantages to the UK government in that situation. But I think if there are sensible heads, they will realise that the disadvantages are much bigger than the advantages. You know, it's a disadvantage to the Scottish government because, in a very simple way, one example is a joint ministerial committee. I sit there with my Welsh counterpart. We are immensely strengthened if there are 2 Northern Irish people there, because always 2, one Sinn Féin and one DUP. And I've worked with the DUP before, and we don't agree on a lot of things, but there are occasions in which they will weigh in defence, for example, of agriculture in Northern Ireland or whatever. The balance is missing. So I don't think that that's a conspiracy, but I do think that the influence of the DUP is a negative thing. I think that accepting the support of the DUP to stay in power, clearly substantial sums of money have been involved in that, though it's not been paid, of course, because there's no administration to hand it over. I think in those circumstances they did something that made it inevitable that they couldn't get a deal because it created circumstances in which the influence of the DUP was too great. The DUP is also 2 parties, by and large. You've got the Northern Irish Assembly DUP and you've got the Westminster DUP, and the Westminster DUP is more extreme and less likely, I think, to be constructive. So I think you've got all those circumstances. I do think that we need an Assembly in Northern Ireland. We need all the parties. I don't think the DUP will be part of this, but I think most of the others in Northern Ireland, perhaps not all, but most of them would be part of it, working with the parties in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales on a common approach. Now, you know, we even had the Tories in that in Scotland over the withdrawal bill for a period of time. We managed to refuse legislative consent with a majority of 90, I think it was 93 to 30, 92 to 30, I can't precisely remember. So we had all the parties except the Tories on that. I think this is one of those circumstances where we try to get as many people as possible in the room. And I have, when I'm in Northern Ireland, I will speak to all the parties. I try to speak to the DUP, it doesn't always happen, but we need to try and keep those channels open. I think there are other things that you might look for conspiracies in, and I think one of the most interesting that I've referred to, apart from we haven't touched at all upon the very doubtful practices of those who've argued for leave and how they ran their campaign. But I do think that the UK government's attempt to frighten the extreme leavers by the consequences of a no deal has backfired spectacularly. I think that started off as a means to corral them into coming along with the Chequers Agreement, and has ended up as beginning to look like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that was very foolish. Yeah.
Time from the gallery. Can you give an insight into the ideology followed by Brexit ministers who believe that they can make a real success of trade outside the EU? What is their economic vision?
Oh, I know I can't. I mean, if I were to, I think it's something like, trying to go into somebody's mind like that would not be good for me. There are people who believe in this at any cost. It is something that is worth doing at any cost. But there are also people who've just inhaled it and just believe it with every fibre of their being and don't look at the reality of the situation. And there are ministers who do believe that there is some miraculous set of trade arrangements that we haven't come to, despite the evidence. And the evidence is overwhelming. Germany is the most successful international exporting and business country, not just in Europe, but one of the most successful in the world. It is in the EU. They are not going to leave the EU. The only country in the world that is not a member of or associated with a trading bloc is Mauritania. And the French ambassador to Washington very memorably said some months ago that to believe that you further the cause of free trade by leaving the world's biggest free trade bloc and 50 free trade arrangements is, to say the least, questionable. But you have people for whom this is an idée fixe. They have believed in this all their life. They now see an opportunity to do it, and they say it without evidence. it is going to be pretty tragic because it cannot be done. There is not, it's just not possible to do that. You also don't have people who have the experience